And this is being co-sponsored by the Department of Religious Studies. The chair is right here, Professor Arthur Lewis. Tonight's lecture is on Pope Francis and the Muslims, and it features Professor Dustin Byrd. Dustin Byrd is an associate professor at Olivet College here in Michigan, where he teaches comparative religion, philosophy, and Arabic. He grew up in South Haven, Michigan. He studied comparative religion, philosophy, music, and history at Western Michigan University, where he earned bachelor's and master's degrees. He then studied for his doctorate at our university, MSU, where he specialized in philosophy of religion, the Frankfurt School, and all manner of social and political thought. Professor Byrd is a specialist in contemporary Islamic thought and the Frankfurt School's critical theory of religion. His research includes the intersections of political philosophy and political theology, the challenge of Islam and modernity, and the role of religion within contemporary liberation movements. He has numerous publications, including a recent book entitled Islam in a Post-Secular Society, Religion, Secularity, and the Antagonism of Recalcitrant Faith. And along with Sayyid Javad Miri, he co-edited the book Malcolm X, From Political Eschatology to Religious Revolutionary. Now, because we have a rather small crowd, I'd like to ask that maybe John come up a little bit so we can have it a little bit more intimate.
Oh, that'll save my voice, yeah.
Yeah.
But I can leave my stuff here, right?
Sure, absolutely. So please feel free to come forward.
All right. Now, this is working, right? You can hear me?
Yes.
It's a small room, but okay, that's good. That's good. If you got here a little bit early, so I had Sam Cooke on, and on the way here I was listening to Sam Cooke, but unfortunately my voice is going out. I was at hockey games all weekend, I must admit, and so screaming at officials is not good for your voice. But so I lost a little bit, and I couldn't sing to Sam Cooke on the way here, which was wounded me. But nevertheless, I'm getting over it. So, hopefully, where did it go? There, no, here we go. Hopefully. So, first and foremost, I'd like to, thank Dr. Versluz for having me on campus to do this lecture, and it's my pleasure to be back in my second home of MSU. In many ways, my first home, but I live in Kalamazoo, so it's the second home. And I'd like to thank Muhammad Khalil for inviting me to do this for the Muslim Studies program. It's amazing to see how much activity that the program has, and all these wonderful, amazing speakers that you bring to campus to study these very important issues concerning Islam and Muslims and modernity, and how it's connecting modernity and all the issues that go around with that. So I'm happy to contribute to that understanding if I can. And then also like to thank any Catholic and Muslims who are here. This is an important issue that I think both communities really should be more in tune with, and so that the fact that people have come to listen to this is heartening. So why am I interested in this issue of Pope Francis and the Muslims? It really has two stories of Genesis stories, and the first is my own personal biography. I was introduced to Malcolm X when I was in high school, and that's what sparked my interest in Islam and the Muslim world. Actually, it's kind of funny. I wanted to date a girl who was a lot smarter than me, and she basically told me that she wouldn't date a dummy, and I had to start reading again because I was into skateboarding and music and all that stuff. And so she handed me the autobiography of Malcolm X and said, "This is what you're going to read." So she's like, "Give me a test," you know what I mean, to date her. So that's what sparked my interest in Islam. And then my interest in papal history, the history of the popes, began with my studying with Dr. Rudolf Siebert at Western Michigan University. Rudy was a Catholic theologian who studied with Pope Benedict XVI when he was in seminary too. They were students together. And so I spent a lot of time studying with Dr. Siebert, who's obviously from Germany, fought in World War II on the German side. Was not a Nazi. He was actually declared an anti-Nazi because he was in an underground Catholic movement that opposed Hitler. But he was 15 years old and conscripted into the Luftwaffe. And so I've traveled to a lot of places in the world with him, studying religion, giving papers, conferences, teaching, and being with a Catholic theologian. And for the last 5 years, I've been going back and forth between here and Rome. And either teaching in Rome with students from the US, bringing them there, or going to a conference at Loyola University at the John Felice Center, where we have a critical theory conference. So I've got a lot of good friends who live in Rome, and most of them are Franciscan monks. So it was interesting stuff. So to get right into this, this year is the 800-year anniversary of the meeting of St. Francis and Sultan Malik al-Kamil, which is where I want to anchor the lecture in this encounter of these two. I wrote in one of the books that Mohammed mentioned, one of the chapters is on this particular encounter between these two men and how their ability to dialogue with each other despite their differences, and we'll talk more about what those differences are, can be used as a template for modern contemporary discourse between Muslims and Christians, and then translated philosophically in my book to how it can be a template for discourse between Muslims and secular people. Right? So that's that, and then I just finished up fixing the proofs for an article for the Hartford Theological Seminary on this very issue of this encounter, this 800-year-old encounter. So, with that, we'll go ahead and start. So, in 1219, in Damietta, Egypt, 800 years ago, you had the commencement of the Fifth Crusade. As you know, the Crusade started in 1096 with Pope Urban II calling for the recapture of Jerusalem from the Muslims. And the First Crusade actually is not called the First Crusade. The First Crusade was the Peasants Crusade, and that's where peasants in religious fervor took off towards the Middle East. They were not in any way, shape, or form professional soldiers, not knights, and they were ritually slaughtered when they got there. But the First Crusade were the knights, the professional soldiers, and they eventually were successful in taking Jerusalem. But as you know, Jerusalem gets taken back not too long after that, especially by Saladin Ayyubi, right, the Kurdish general. But the Fifth Crusade occurs in the 13th century, and after a failed attack on Jerusalem, the Christian Holy Army reconsidered its tactics. Right? So they attempted to recapture Jerusalem through first conquering the Ayyubian state of Egypt, which is led by the Kurdish Sultan Malik al-Kamil, one of the important people in our stories. He was, of course, the nephew of the Emir Saladin Ayyubi. This Holy Army, as it was called, was comprised of Dutch, Flemish, and Frisian soldiers. Frisian, if you have a Dutch background, you know the very famous name De Vries. My grandmother was a De Vries, and that means you're from Friesland, in the very northern part of the Netherlands. So Southern Dutch, Flemish, and Frisian soldiers, and their Seljuk Muslim allies. And the Crusaders fought a bitter and bloody battle near the banks of the Damietta branch of the Nile River in Lower Egypt, which is in the north. You see famous pictures of that. Now, although the Sultan offered a peace deal to the Christian invaders numerous times, the papal legate Pelagio Galvani, also known as Pelagius, rejected such offers and would accept nothing but total defeat of the Muslims and the destruction of Cairo. However, before the Christians were defeated in 1221, an unlikely event occurred, an event that would serve as a framework for interreligious discourse between Catholics and Muslims. That event, of course, was the arrival of St. Francis of Assisi on the shores of Egypt. He was there either looking for peace or martyrdom, one or the other. Against the will of Pelagius and the commanders of the crusading forces, St. Francis and his companions crossed the battle line in search of the Sultan, in search of discourse, in search of winning the Sultan to Christ. One can imagine the look on the Muslims' faces as they saw this ragged man from the barbarians of Europe approaching most humbly and unarmed. He must have looked just as crazy to the Muslim forces as he did to the Crusaders. Nevertheless, he was taken to the Sultan, who received him graciously, having recognized his religious vocation. Francis stayed with the Sultan for days. As historians, we assume they engaged in a robust dialogue, discourse, and debate on various religious matters. but there are no contemporary records of the substance of their discussions. We can imagine the two of them discussing the nature of Jesus of Nazareth, sin and sinfulness, the nature and status of Mary, the mother of Jesus, war and peace, the life of Prophet Muhammad, and many other points of agreement and disagreement between Islam and Christianity. Now, the Sultan had a privileged classical Islamic education, while Francis was deeply entrenched in the Imitatio Christi, or the imitation of Christ, as a way of being in the world. And between the two, there was some overlapping consensus where they could talk to each other. What we do know is that St. Francis would return safely to the Crusaders. Once there, he would again appeal for peace from the Crusaders, and once again, he would be rebuffed. Francis would return to Assisi a total failure. No martyrdom, no peace. But was he a failure? Yes. If that's what he was looking for, yes. But can this story be read in a different way? Yes, I think it can. Right? The Pope of Rome today, Pope Francis, of course, doesn't see this as a failure at all. Rather, it is a beginning. St. Francis and the Sultan, in so many ways, are a model for discourse, for interreligious discourse. Now, here's Papa Francesco. I took this picture a couple years ago during the Wednesday event where he comes out and greets the pilgrims, the general audience, every Wednesday morning. So if you ever find yourself in Rome on a Wednesday, just go over there, rain or shine, he'll come out in the Pope Mobile. And if you bring a baby, he'll pick him up and give him nice kisses. So Pope Francis is the 266th pontiff of the Catholic Church. He's a Jesuit from Argentina. Pope Francis was elected on the 13th of March 2013, not long after his successor, Pope Benedict XVI, Joseph Ratzinger, resigned from the papacy. Born Jorge Bergoglio, Pope Francis was the first pope to assume the name Francis, and did so for very specific reasons. Those reasons can be found in two of his most important: at the service of others. To wash your feet, this is a symbol, a sign that I am at your service. But it also means that we have to help each other. This broke with tradition, as this Mass is usually held in a Roman basilica with the feet of clerics being washed. Instead, this was at a jail with the sinners from other faiths, genders, and nationalities. Not new for the Pope, coming from Argentina, because this was his normal ritual way of doing Maundy Thursday. But this certainly was new for Rome, and it sent a signal to Rome that things have changed. It also reminds me of the rule that St. Francis first wrote, the rule for the friars, the Brothers Minor, the order of the Franciscans, the first rule, which was eventually suppressed by the Catholic Church because it was quite radical. And one of the things he writes in the first rule for the Brothers Minor is that when the Franciscans go into the land of the Muslims, they should not try to preach to them, but they should be at their service. So in the second picture, by the way, there are immigrants from Mali, Eritrea, Syria, Pakistan, who are all, in this case, representatives of Muslims, Hindus, Catholics, and one Coptic Christian. On July 8, 2013, was the famous and unfortunate accident of Lampedusa. As you know, there has been, especially since 2014, a lot of people fleeing parts of Africa and the Middle East and trying to get to Europe through the Mediterranean, usually on rickety ships with human smugglers who are putting as many people as they possibly can on these ships. There's no one who actually knows how to drive these boats. They're just put on these boats and sent, go that way. Generally, they're trying to get to the small island of Lampedusa, which is in between Tunisia and Sicily. And on July 8, 2013, as they were trying to signal another ship in the general area, they set off a flare, and that flare ended up starting this boat on fire. In this case, of the 360 people that were on that little boat, you can imagine 360 people on that little boat, only 155 were rescued. The rest drowned at sea. This was a part of the ongoing humanitarian crisis in the Middle East and in North Africa. They were just only a quarter of a mile away from the island when everyone died. Pope Francis' first official trip outside of Rome was to the small island of Lampedusa to commemorate the loss of these refugees. So this is soon after he was elected the Pope, and his first official trip outside of Rome itself was to Lampedusa. Pope Francis criticized what he called the globalization of indifference, stating, "We have become used to the suffering of others. It doesn't affect us. It doesn't interest us. It's not our business." Right? That was the attitude that he felt must be undone. Wearing purple, the color of repentance, he said their suffering was a thorn in his heart, and he laid a wreath where the boat had capsized. The following year, in 2014, he visits Turkey. In the midst of the ISIS attacks in Iraq and Syria, just to the south of Turkey, Pope Francis visits Istanbul and prays with Istanbul's Mufti Rahmi Yaran at the famous Blue Mosque. In the true meaning of pontifex or bridge builder, the Pope stood facing the mihrab, the prayer niche facing towards Mecca, in silent adoration. In doing so, he displayed the ecumenicism that he has been known for since being a bishop in Argentina, although he was criticized heavily for praying in a mosque by generally the Catholic right, who saw that as inappropriate. Not too long after that, 2015, he made some very controversial statements in regards to the Charlie Hebdo attack. I actually wrote a book about the Charlie Hebdo attack and what came out of it. I think you actually wrote something for it, you know, some kind of nice kind words. I probably didn't deserve it, but you wrote nice kind words. So, in January 7, 2015, two brothers, Said and Sharif Kouachi, attacked the offices of Charlie Hebdo. And Charlie Hebdo was a satirical magazine in Paris, known for mocking religion, especially Muslims, Muhammad, as well as Catholics and Jews. These two men killed 12 workers, including the editor of Charlie Hebdo, Stéphane Charbonnier, and the cartoonists Cabou, Honoré, Tegnous, and Wolinski. Amidst the Je suis Trali rallies that followed the killing, the Pope challenged the knee-jerk reaction to the massacre, stating, "If my good friend here, Dr. Gaspari, says a curse word against my mother, he can expect a punch. One cannot provoke, one cannot insult other people's faith, one cannot make fun of faith, one cannot hide a truth. Everyone has the right to practice their religion. One cannot offend, make war, or kill in the name of one's religion, that is, in the name of God." When Pope Francis was, critics accused the Pope of equivocating, condoning terrorism in the name of religion. The Pope routinely denounced violence in the name of religion. He does it over and over and over again, while also arguing for respect for religious faith. It's not an either-or proposition, in his opinion, but both must be condemned, both the attack on religion and the killing or violence within the name of religion. This was especially clear when Pope Francis commemorated the Catholic priest Jacques Hamel, who I write about in the book there. After he was murdered in his church at Saint-Étienne-du-Rouvray by two ISIS-inspired teenagers in 2016. They broke into the church while he was saying Mass. They killed a nun and killed the priest, Jacques Hamel. The Pope declared Jacques to be a martyr in the light of in odium fide, which means in the hatred of the faith, and has put him on track towards canonization. Yet the Pope reminded the world that this was not Islam, he said, but rather was the work of Satan. He found it unfair to attribute violence to Islam when violence is a common affair among all religions as well as the non-religious. This murder, along with the Pope's call for inter-religious solidarity, led the churches of France to be full the following Sunday, but it was full of Muslims the next following Sunday after the murder. He reminded us that legacies are not destinies. The legacies of the antagonists between Christians and Muslims do not have to be the destinies of the future. Now, there's been a lot of backlash against this Pope, which is, for a lot of people, hard to believe, considering that he's very popular. very popular among people who are not Catholic, very popular among people who are, very popular among Muslims actually. He's actually one of the most popular religious figures among Muslims. But nevertheless, there's been a lot of backlash, nationalists and traditionalists especially. So Pope Francis is not without his detractors. Among them are those within Europe's New Right, a collection of anti-immigrant, right-wing populists, traditionalists, paleo-conservatives, and various neo-fascist groups have nothing good to say about Pope Francis. They see Pope Francis' openness to immigrants, especially Muslims, as being a threat to the West, particularly its Christian heritage, or what's left of that heritage. Thus, paradoxically, as Pope Francis attempts to reconcile the Church to the Gospels, especially its social gospel, he is accused of being the destroyer of the last remaining vestiges of Christendom in Europe. Right? That's the basic argument. As you attempt to become more Christian substantively, you are killing off the last vestiges of Christianity in Europe because of the openness you have towards these others, to the other people who are bringing different culture, and you're contributing to deculturalization, as they would say in France. So by embodying the core Christian virtues of compassion and mercy for the other, he is acting as the Trojan horse for Europe's colonization by invaders, right? This is the term they're using, from the Muslim world. In other words, he's contributing to le grand remplacement, or as we've heard, of course, from this past weekend, the Great Replacement. The guy who actually developed this theory, replacement theory, his name is René Camus. He lives in a 14th century castle in France. I've been in contact with him for the last few months, and now he won't talk to me. I made some critiques of some of his arguments, and he stopped sending me emails. So I'm writing a book on some of these issues, and thought it best to talk to these people who I'm writing about. But that's so for him, this whole idea that the Pope is the conduit, right, who's giving the religious legitimation for bringing in more immigrants into Europe, or the legitimation for mass immigration into Europe, that somehow the Pope then is the vessel by which Christianity is destroyed in Europe. Right? So, now, this guy might look familiar. No less than Steve Bannon, the former filmmaker that helped craft the populist message of Donald Trump, has teamed up with such nationalist populist groups in Italy and France to undermine the Pope's call for solidarity with refugees and immigrants. As you see a picture here, this poster was put up all of around Rome one evening last year, and I'll give you the translation, just be Italian. It says, "Hey Frank, you took over congregations, suspended priests, decapitated the Order of Malta and the Franciscans of the Immaculate. You ignore cardinals. Where is your mercy?" These posters were quickly taken down by the Roman authorities, but this was the critique from the Catholic right, against Pope Francis, especially how he's treated Cardinal Raymond Burke. Now, Raymond Burke is among the most prominent detractors of Pope Francis. He's an arch-conservative Catholic cleric, has criticized the Pope for his liberal stance on LGBTQ issues. He's criticized Pope Francis' critique of capitalism, and he's criticized him on his openness towards Islam. He believes that the Pope has created chaos in the Church as it pertains to Catholic doctrine, social teachings, and relationship with other religions. In his book, Cardinal Burke's book, he writes, "It is necessary for the Church and for her members to understand correctly what Islam is and what the Quran teaches. Islam is not just another religious practice that can coexist in harmony with other religions. Islam is a religion that, according to its own interpretation, must also become a state. The Quran and the authentic interpretations of it, given by various experts in Quranic law, is destined to govern the world. In reality, there is no place for other religions, even though they may be tolerated, as long as Islam has not succeeded in establishing its sovereignty over the nations and over the world. It is important for Christians to realize the radical difference between Islam and Christianity in matters concerning their teachings about God, about conscience, etc. If you really understand Islam," Raymond Burke says, "you understand that the Church really should be afraid of it." For Cardinal Byrd, the Pope's openness to Muslims is just another example of his accommodating spirit to modernity, relativism, and multiculturalism, all of which weaken the bonds of the West with its historical faith, as he says, which he sees as the only antidote to the nihilism of secular modernity, or restored Catholicism. Now, Milo Yiannopoulos, I'm sure you know of him. Even the British provocateur Milo Yiannopoulos has written a book against the Pope entitled Diabolical, right? Claiming that the Pope's not really a Christian because of how he's dealt with clerical sex abuse scandals, which Yiannopoulos himself was a victim of. In his book, Milo says, much of the Catholic hierarchy has pandered to Islam. With the exception of Benedict XVI, popes have, for generations, appealed to Muslims for no discernible reason, while Muslims persecute and murder Christians all over the Middle East. They murder gays too, of course, which ought to be trouble for the Catholic clergy more than it does, right? For obvious reasons. Back in 1999, Pope John Paul II, was proudly photographed kissing the Quran, a book that denies Christ. Why? Has any Muslim ever kissed a crucifix? If Catholic bishops spend as much time talking about sins as they do working out how to pointlessly reach out to Muslims, their congregations would grow fivefold. That's just some of the detraction from the Pope. Nevertheless, regardless of his detractors, the Pope continues to be very popular among centrist and left-leaning Catholics, or liberal left-leaning Catholics. I'm not one of those described that liberals are leftists, as well as among those outside of the Catholic Church. In this picture, he stands shoulder to shoulder with other religious leaders for his anti-slavery summit at the Vatican, wherein leaders of various religious faiths pledged to combat human trafficking in their communities and nations. Even without being a revolutionary, because he certainly is not, he's a very conservative guy, or even a radical reformer, his change of tone in the church, or his emphasis on different parts of church teachings, has endeared him to millions who see him as a world leader, not just a leader of the Catholic Church. Just last month, he signed the document, Human Fraternity for World Peace and Living Together, with the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar University, Ahmed Al-Tayyib, and presided over the first public mass in the Gulf state. Think about in 2014, he prayed at the Israeli security wall in Jerusalem, which was not popular among the Israeli government that he did that he prayed for the wall to be removed. And later on, he invited Mahmoud Abbas and Shimon Peres, who was the president of Israel at the time, to have a summit in the Vatican to talk about peace in the Middle East. So this Pope, by and large, has been controversial, to say the least. When I'm in Rome, I certainly get an earful from all my friends about the chaos that they think the Pope has caused on the one hand, yet at the same time lauding his desire to reconcile the church to the Gospels. And you can imagine if someone who is going to buck a lot of tradition, you're going to have a lot of controversy. So with that, grazie, it's enough.
Thank you for that. We have time for questions now?
Yeah, absolutely. Time for questions. Yes, ma'am.
I have two clarified questions. When Pope Francis prayed in Turkey, did he pray the Muslim way, like behind an imam, or just like?
No.
Okay.
Yeah, they stood shoulder to shoulder with the imam, so they both prayed in their way. And the Pope was asked about his prayer, and he said that it was a prayer for peace, and it was silent contemplation. And like I said, there was a lot of detractors that said that was absolutely inappropriate to have a Christian prayer in a mosque. And he questioned that, like, why would it be inappropriate, right? And the Muslims welcomed me here, right? It never was inappropriate for Christians to pray in a mosque. In fact, there's a history of that between these two religions, of opening up their spaces for the others to use. When I was in Bosnia not too long ago, that was something that they talked a lot about during the war, that Bosnian Christians were allowed to make their prayers in the mosque, and there was no problem with that. The problem came with the Serbs when they would say, no, you can't do that out there whatsoever. So, But he stuck to his stance on that.
And then one more question. I forget, it was one of Pope's opposers, but they said they murder gays too, which is problematic for obvious reasons.
Right.
What are the obvious?
I think what Milo was trying to say there is that there's a higher level of gay priests, and so therefore, if they're killing gays, that should be a problem for Catholics, since there's a high level of gay priests within gays in the clergy. So I think that's all he was talking about there.
Yeah, there was a joke on Penn and Teller's show on Showtime about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so I mean that was, there's been pretty decent books written in terms of critiques of Francis. And I think a lot of it is not necessarily a critique of what Francis is doing, but more of a critique of what people think he's doing. So there's perspective from people outside of the Catholic Church that think he's really changing things, like he's changing doctrine, right? And really no doctrine has been changed by Pope Francis. In fact, he doesn't really have the power to unilaterally change doctrine. But there's that perspective, since he's put such a shift on this intersubjective relationships with other religions and whatnot, that people assume that he's changing doctrine, but he's not. He's actually quite conservative. So he's not a revolutionary by any stretch of means. Yes.
Really appreciated the lecture. Question for you: where do you think Pope Francis is wanting to take this?
Where he's wanting to take it?
What's his end goal?
Yeah.
His dream. His end.
I would say, in terms of his dream or his end goal, I think if he can end his papacy having established better relationships between the Christians, especially among Catholics and Muslims, I think that's all he's hoping to do. On that front, I mean, there's the front with the environment, there's the front with the poor and things like that, which are just as equally important for him. But I think, if he can just move the relationship to a more peaceful, more reconciled relationship, even just a little bit, I think he would consider that a success. Especially considering the 1400-year antagonism that there has been, overcoming that on the basis of Francis and Sultan Malik Kamil as a model. Just a friendlier relationship. And that would include, from the perspective of Francis, that Christians, especially Catholics, have to be reconciled to the Gospels, right? That means they have to embody those very principles and values of mercy and compassion, right? That are so lacking in what he would talk about the modern world, with capitalism, with materialism, with greed, and on and on. Those values are missing, and therefore Catholics have to be distinguishable from that world. And not be reconciled to that world, but distinguishable from that world. And in that distinguishability, they are reconciling themselves to the Gospels and opening themselves up to the other. Thank you. Ben, what's your question?
Oh,
That's my son, by the way.
I think I've argued with some of this stuff.
Yeah, he's been hearing me talk about these things for years. He actually went to Rome with me a few years back. We went and saw the Pope.
Yeah, that picture was the favorite.
Was that the same year that you?
Yeah.
So, there you go. Yes, sir.
Well, a couple of things. First of all, I wondered, are you aware of him releasing any statements following the New Zealand attacks? And then also, I wonder if you could talk about maybe the evolution of his relationship with Muslims over the duration of his papacy.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think the Vatican put out something about the New Zealand attack. But I haven't seen anything specifically about him, but he probably said something. He may have said something in the Angelus, which was last Sunday, which I probably have to go back and see if he did, because I'm pretty sure he does. He's usually up on these things. Oh, by the way, he has an app too, the Pope app, and he tweets and he puts something on the Pope app, and the Vatican does. Whether he does or not is another question. But in terms of his evolution, he was first very much into intersubjective, religious discourse with the Jewish community in Buenos Aires, Argentina. There wasn't a large Muslim community there, but he did have a lot of connections with the smaller community that was there. And they came to his church. He went to the mosque. So he established that practice back in Argentina, and then he took it to Rome with him. And so a lot of the things he did there would not be normative for a pope in Rome, but nevertheless, he brought those practices there. In fact, the day he was elected, and they wanted to give him the red shoes and the nice sack and all the new thing, the nice mitre and whatnot, he basically told them, to quote him, "The charade is over," is what he said. And that's a big distinction between him and Benedict XVI. Benedict was very much into tradition. This is the way it's been done for so many hundreds of years, or more. That's the way we're going to do it. And Pope Francis just basically said, no, I'm not doing that. He doesn't stay in the papal apartment, which is the second largest apartment in all of Europe. He doesn't stay there. They brought him up there after he was elected. He walked into a few rooms and he said, this is not going to work, right? And he stays down in Santa Marta, which is on the south side of St. Peter's, and he stays in a 2-room cell, right, with other clerics and other monks who are visiting the Vatican. He used to sneak off the Vatican grounds. I don't know if you know this. Where's the Pope? He's gone, right? They didn't know where he went, but he would sneak off the Vatican grounds to go get pizza. You get pizza. One time he snuck off to get new eyeglasses, and he said, I just miss being anonymous, right? Because now everyone knows him. Within those first so many months, he could still sneak off and do those things, but they told him he couldn't do it anymore. So pilgrims started bringing him pizzas to the general audiences on Wednesday mornings. So they would bring pizzas to him, so they would stack pizzas up on the Pope Mobile. Yeah, so in terms of his relationship to Muslims, that has developed, I think, especially because he's the pontiff at a time where these issues are so important, especially with ISIS, with the Syrian civil war, with the Arab Spring, or what's lingering on with the Arab Spring, the ramifications of it, and he's the pontiff at this time. And that's the reason why he's been, in many ways, pushed to deal with these things very publicly. And at the same time, the backlash that's going on in Europe right now with white nationalism, the neo-fascism, all those things that are happening, that I see very quite clearly when I'm there. They're there. It's very open about it. So,
I have 2 questions.
Yeah.
The first one is, what has been the response of Muslim leaders to Pope Francis reaching out? And then the second, it's very interesting, this concept of him being like the Trojan horse.
mm-hmm.
So how do you counter that? You know, that argument that, because really, in a way, it's true.
Yeah. Well, in the first question about Muslim leaders, he's met with a lot of Muslim leaders who have been very open for him and open to him because he's been a good Franciscan. It's really interesting in Franciscan studies. For instance, if you go to Rome, the Pontificate University for Islamic and Arab Studies is run by Franciscans. And the Pontifical University Antonianum has a lot of Franciscans in there, and they deal with a lot of these issues too. So the Franciscans, for some reason, I think it has a lot to do with St. Francis himself being open to the Muslims, are well trusted in the Muslim world. And I think it has to do with this imitatio Christi. Francis himself was called Auto Christus in Latin, the other Christ, because he's so identified with Christ's way of being in the world, with the poverty, with the compassion for the other, with embracing the outcast, that the Franciscans, in carrying on that tradition, have become, the most, I would say, the most trusted part of the Catholic Church. And the fact that this man, who comes from the Jesuits, right, the Society of Jesus, St. Loyola, and he comes in and he takes the name Francis, I think it's more than a sign. It's a signal to the world, right, that my papacy is going to be about the poor, and it's going to be about opening up to the outcast, to those who have been left in the ditch of history, to those who have been excluded in the economy of exclusion, as he calls it. And so, yeah, because of that authenticity, he's had a lot of relationships with the imams of Al-Azhar. He's been with Iranian Shia imams and scholars. And so that's not something that I think Benedict would have been too comfortable with, despite the fact they probably could have had a nice conversation on theology. I don't think, because he was a good theologian, he really was. First-rate theologian, even very conservative, right? But Francis has a different pastoral nature to him, and I think that opens him up to the Muslims.
Any interaction with Saudi Arabia?
And his reaction, yeah, Saudi Arabia is very interesting with the Gulf states. So just last month he was in the UAE, right? And that's where they signed the document there about Human Fraternity. Where did I put it? Somewhere around there. But it was a very beautiful document. If you get the chance to read it, it's on the Vatican's website. It's called Human Fraternity. And he signed that with Imam of Al-Azhar. He's been criticized for not being tough enough on Gulf states and the persecution of Christians in Gulf states, or in not letting Christians in the Gulf states practice their religion openly. I can't really speak to that, why that is, if that's a strategy, right? Maybe there's a backdoor discussions about that. I'm not sure. But in the document, Human Fraternity, he does talk about how certain states have to get rid of this idea of minorities and give all peoples full citizenship, which includes the right to practice their religion in public. And the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar signed that. Now, if the Wahhabi clerics in Saudi Arabia are really going to listen to the Imam of Al-Azhar, or even less the Pope, is a whole other question, but I'm certainly doubtful they will. But in terms of the Trojan horse thing, yeah, you're right. In many ways, it's true.
But then how do you counter that?
It's a very difficult thing to counter that, especially in Europe. It's easier here, right? We have what the Germans call here in America a Volksgemeinschaft, or excuse me, a Willensgemeinschaft. A Willensgemeinschaft is a willed community, a community where we are not, as a people, not predicated on pre-political foundations. So we don't define ourselves as Americans because of our ethnicity, because of our language, because of our shared history. We define ourselves based on political principles: life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, freedom, justice, democracy, Declaration of Independence, the Constitution. That's what defines us as a single people, right? Despite the diversity, we're a single people because we will ourselves into existence as a people. Whereas in Europe, you have a Volksgemeinschaft, which is a people's community. And the people's community is predicated on pre-political foundations: race, language, ethnicity, shared history, that type of stuff. So when you have immigrants coming in, and within, say, a generation, right, not based on our ethnicity, for instance. And so this is a continuing problem in Europe, and it's getting worse and worse and worse. Every year I go, I see it getting worse. And that's why I wrote that book, Islam in the Post-Secular Society, which is about this very issue of Muslims going into Europe and the identity backlash that's causing. And so you saw that again with the New Zealand murder, right? With the killing of these guys and the Great Replacement. That's a common, not even a trope, it's a common belief among the groups, and it's based on demographic change. And from my perspective as a political philosopher looking at that, by simply saying, oh, these people are crazy, you're not actually dealing with the real issues that they're experiencing. If you don't deal with the real issues they're experiencing, and which includes demographic change, you're never going to be able to fight this, this move adequately. But demographic change is a destabilizing force for a lot of people, right? A lot of us are anywhere people, right? Sociologists say there's anywhere people and somewhere people. Anywhere people are going to feel comfortable wherever they go in the world, right? They're open to other people. They spend some time in, India, or if they go to Russia, or they go to Latin America, they're going to eventually feel comfortable and, be very open to people. And there's a somewhere people. These are people who have to be rooted in a given area. And what destabilizes their sense of identity is when that given area starts to change. And it's changing, in their minds, illegitimately by outside forces who are forcing that change on them. And that's what you see in a lot of European societies today. It's still a minority position, but it's growing. There's no doubt about that. And the liberal state has to be able to address that if it's going to be able to beat this back. Yeah.
To maybe counter like the Trojan horse thing, what is the purpose of perpetuating a sort of like false Christianity? I don't understand. Yeah. So Pope Francis, what he's trying to do is trying to reunite Catholicism with the Gospels in being more open to people like Muslims. Right. Suppose the argument is then that no, we need to be more closed as a society to retain what we have.
Right.
It's still just perpetuating like a fake version of Christianity. So what's the point?
Yeah. Well, the point is that most of the people who would argue that the Christian identity is the bulwark against Islamization or Eurabia or all these other things they call it, they don't actually believe in Christianity. Right? They're cultural Christians, right? So that is, Nietzsche always said that God is dead. That's all Nietzsche's whole thing with the madman. But what he says is that the churches are the tombs of God, right? And these people don't care whether God's alive, dead, whatever, as long as the churches are there, right? Because the churches represent an identity. It's an inherited identity, the Greco-Roman Christian identity. They say Judeo-Christian now. Can you imagine a bunch of neo-Nazis are saying Judeo-Christian identity? Yeah, get over it. You never believe in that, right? But it's all it is. It's part of the identity by which it stands as a defense against the changing nature of Europe. And so they're not calling, like Pope Francis, calling to become religious again, right? Or to somehow return to the churches and to believe in things that they don't believe in. Most of these guys that I'm studying on the far right don't believe God exists. Most of them are atheists. They certainly don't believe in revelation or the day of judgment, or they don't believe in angels or any of that stuff. Yet, they want the Christian identity to be very strong because it is the bulwark against Islamization. Or, interesting enough, some of them, like Alain de Benoit, for instance, actually says not Christianity, but European paganism, going even behind the church, right? Going behind Christianization of Europe. European paganism is the bulwark against Islam because Islam and Christianity are too close. Remember, Hitler called Christianity the Bolshevism of the Roman Empire, right? It was the communists of the Roman Empire who did away with the Christian identity and their paganism and their strength and their heroicism and made it very feminine, made it very internationalist, globalist.
Non-militarized.
Right? Yes, they're definitely non-militarized, right? As if European society actually adopted a non-militaristic position. Nevertheless, right, it was the idea that the heroic, powerful values of the pagans were undermined by this feminine religion that talked about peace and humbleness and meekness and piety and things like that. So that's a split within the far right in Europe right now between the neo-pagans and those who are saying no, Christianity is the thing. Roger Scruton's another one of these guys that says Christian. He doesn't believe anything, but Christianity is the inherited identity of Europe. Yes.
So, to what extent do you think, are you agree with me that the relationship between Muslim and Christian in Middle East has a stereotype image in media coverage?
The media coverage of it?
Yes.
Yeah.
And the media there have a responsibility of the hate speech between, or to transfer the hate speech between each other?
Yeah, no, there's a lot of that. One of the things that when we talk about multiculturalism, for instance, in the West always brings this up as, we're multicultural, or we're championing multiculturalism, and it's like, hang on a sec, the Middle East has been doing that for a long time, right? With Christian populations, Jewish populations, Muslim populations, living in relative peace, peaceful situation. And then you have the politics on top of it, modern politics, especially after the Sykes-Picot Agreement, where Europe cut all the lines in the sand, divided everybody up, favored one group over another group, pit each other against each other. And then after that you have professional media, those who are ingrained or somehow invested in a certain group within a country, maintaining power. And then of course the demonization of the minorities. If you go to Egypt, the demonization of the Copts, for instance, despite the fact in Islamic history, the Copts were actually quite welcoming of the Muslims when they conquered, because that meant they were no longer going to be under the thumb of Rome, the Catholics, right? And so, yeah, there's a lot of invested interest in the status quo, or in this divide et impera, as they would say in Latin, divide and conquer, right? So the status quo has to remain as it is, and the media is one tool in which it can be done that way. And that's one of the interesting things about social media, because it's independent of the power structures run by the people. So if you look at like the Arab Spring in Egypt, how social media was used to unite the people. Now, of course, those divisions came in between the younger reform-minded or revolutionary-minded people and the Ikhwan al-Muslimun, right, the Muslim Brotherhood. But in the mobilization of people, it was an alternative form of media that allowed them to do that, as opposed to the official state-sponsored media, which invests or is invested in the status quo remaining the same. Yeah.
Very good. We'll take one more question.
Sure.
Do you think some of the pushback that Francis has been getting may come from the fact that he is breaking long-held and in some ways citing it as maybe more important than the Gospel's traditions that have been held within the church? And that's very hard for a more tradition-based religion than a Gospel-based religion.
Yeah.
And that's that transition, which I think is very important, has created a lot of questioning about foundation.
Yeah, absolutely. When traditionalists argue that the reason why the Catholic Church is still pretty strong in the world is because it's held on to tradition, whereas, say, more of the mainstream Protestant denominations let so much of that go in the Reformation, and then they become increasingly reconciled with modernity and constantly changing things and opening things up, and that's one of the reasons why they're slowly dwindling. So the traditionalists have a good point when they say that. Maintaining the tradition is one of the distinguishing markers of the Catholic community from the rest of the world, right? And that's one of the reasons why it's still growing, Catholicism. It is Islam and Catholicism, really the two growing traditions still, by and large, and some smaller ones. But so yeah, the gospel, if it's just the gospel, like in the Protestants, where that's the authority as opposed to the four authorities with Catholicism, if you have just the gospel, it's pretty minimal, right? You can move things around it. But when you have a tradition that's been maintained for hundreds of years, and all of a sudden you have a pontiff who is just going to push back against that, or just not do it, right? Like Pope Francis is. It's definitely going to be destabilizing. It's definitely going to ruffle feathers among traditionalists. And I think he has a calculus. I think Pope Francis has a calculus. It's like, I can continue with these traditions and violate what I think is a sincere dedication, a commitment to gospel positions or gospel traditions, or I can continue with this tradition and somehow ignore that stuff, right? And I think that he has made the decision ultimately that if the tradition doesn't serve the gospel, then the tradition is negotiable. And so it's those gospel values that come first. And that is an absolute opposite of Benedict.
Yeah, absolutely.
Benedict was the complete other way around. So, yeah, all right.
Well, thank you for a very interesting presentation. Let me thank you. I encourage you to check out our flyers. We have a whole bunch of upcoming events. So thank you for coming.
Yes, thank you all for coming. Great audience.